Today we're talking about support builds. Now there's a massive amount of information when it comes to building supports and how to do it in the current season. We're going to focus on the most crucial parts for playing support in Season 4. This will not be as in-depth as I could go. I try to cover as much as possible in a very short amount of time in order to give you the most compressed information. I will give you links for further information if you want to look into it more. Later in the video I'll also address the question of why I don't recommend the selfish support anymore. Before we talk about the items that I do recommend, let us quickly talk about some items that I don't recommend. The first one that I don't recommend is rushing Breastplate of Valor after boots. I have addressed this in another video already, but I would like to point out here again because it's specifically important for support. Breastplate of Valor does not give you good effective health. It gives you a lot of cooldown reduction, but it only really helps you when you're very ahead. If I see a support doing really poorly in a game, it is very often because they rush Breastplate of Valor right after boots, they don't have any health, they get bursted by the mages, and even the protections on that item are not that good. The reason for Breastplate of Valor is the quick cooldown reduction, and there are other ways to get that a little later into the game much better. You can still get Breastplate of Valor later if you need it, but it should not be your first full defensive item. Polar Mike also has a video that I'm gonna link later, and he points out that if you're really looking for a cooldown reduction as much as possible, then you can also build Sands of Time in your build a little later. With Breastplate of Valor, you pay 2,300 for 20% cooldown reduction, whereas with Sands of Time, you pay 800 for 10% cooldown reduction, so it's a lot cheaper. Therefore, this is a good alternative if you're looking for CDR, but you're still looking for decent defensive items, so you can just build a full defense item with health and physical defense first, and then look for Sands of Time to get that extra CDR. This is more of a niche case, and I wouldn't generally recommend it, but it's for those of you who really want that CDR. Obviously, you should not rush Sands of Time right after boots in that case either. The other item that I don't recommend anymore that I used to recommend is Hide of the Urchin. We'll get into why when we talk about other items, because basically the functionality of this item has been replaced by items that are more team-oriented while still having similar stats in a way. I'll also talk a little more about this when we get to the selfish support. Now let's talk about the items that you should build. The important thing with supports is that you should not have one set in stone build most of the time. You have many situationals, that's always been the case, even with the selfish support. You should have certain options that you're looking for depending on the enemy team comp. There are certain constants, certain items that are often helpful and they will often find in your build. That does not mean that you should always build that and that they're always core. There's one item that I would say is pretty much always core, and that is Watcher's Gift. There's the exception case with warriors maybe, with a war flag that you can run, but generally speaking, Watcher's Gift is what you want, especially as a newer player on a support. This item has a good mix of stats. It has health, it has protections, it has MP5, and it gives you extra health and mana and gold for assists. So this item just has it all. It's just designed for supports. It's designed to make you lane with somebody else, and I don't see any reason to skip it. Mark of the Vanguard is great. I do not say that you should not build Mark of the Vanguard later at all, but as the item that you should start with, I would always go for Watcher's Gift. And as we're already talking about starts, let's quickly talk about what you can build with Watcher's Gift. You could build your tier 1 boots, you could build Bamba's Mask, or you could build Chalice of the Oracle. Along with that, you should always get some health and mana potions to sustain a lane, maybe even multi-potions depending on who you're playing. What I would generally recommend is going for boots unless you know why you're building something else. Bambas is kind of hard to coordinate in many non-pre-made team settings, so it's kind of a risky choice. And Chalice of the Oracle is something that you have to consider for yourself. Do you think you will place those wards that early? Is it going to be worth it for you? Are you not going to fall behind too much in builds? Are you maybe looking to fall behind a little bit in your build because you're late game support anyways and you just want to save up that gold for later? It's up to you. With boots, you get a head start in items and you can snowball a little better. With the Chalice, you have the chance to just get those wards out right away and not get aggressed on, plus to get more gold over the game by not spending as much on wards. Both options perfectly fine. Your first item afterwards should pretty much always be boots. The question of which boots is completely up to you. I do think that there's often a reason to go either for Travelers or Reinforced, simply because they generally provide you with more supportive stats, either extra gold or protective stats, but even Pen and CDR boots have their reasons to be built. For example, Fafnir has some more protections in his kit, so he doesn't need Reinforced just as much. It will give him more protections though, but CDR helps him to get his Dragon form more often, which is his key, essential part of how he functions. So that, for example, would be a reason to go into CDR boots if you want to. Or Ares has so much high aggression that he can go into Pen boots. With that out of the way, let's get into the aura trio of items that I think you can basically justify in pretty much every game. One of them is Gauntlet of Thebes, the other one is Sovereignty, and then there's Heartward Amulet. They are all three aura items, and auras are very strong, especially when combined against certain characters that go for flat penetration, because you will offer your team so many protections that will save them from all that extra damage, and flat penetration is all the rave at the moment, especially with flat reduction being more of a thing through Spear of the Magus as well. So that really helps your team. With Gauntlet of Thebes, you get 400 health, 15 HP 5, and you get a magical and physical protection aura, 20 each for your whole team. Very, very strong aura. The problem with Gauntlet is that the tier 2 is relatively weak, so you have to get there first. If you get enough gold for this item right away, I would probably build it. If you're a little bit behind or you're getting pressured, then I would opt for something else. Something else usually is Sovereignty. Sovereignty is just the item to go for early on. 2100 gold, 200 health, 30 physical protection, but an aura with an additional 30 physical protection for everyone around you. On top of that, and 25 HP 5. So a lot of health, a lot of sustain, a lot of protection for your team in this item as well. The reason why it should be preferred over Heartward most of the time is because it gives you physical protection, but also helps against structures, against minions and all that stuff. And it also has a little more for your team through the higher protection aura and through the HP 5, which is a better, well, component to an aura than an MP5 is. MP5 is nice for some characters, but health over the course of a team fight is something great, or just in general to help your teammates sustain. So these two are already very strong, but Heartward Amulet is not far behind. Heartward Amulet, 2100 gold, 45 magical protection, 200 health, and a 20 magical protection aura plus 20 MP5. So this one's more for magical comps if you, for example, against a magical ADC. Rarely seen these days, but it can happen. Or if you just stick around mid lane a lot, just getting pressured by a snowballing mage, this is something to build early, usually more of a secondary order item between the others. So with these three, you get protections for your team at all times, and it's at least 40 of each. So those are pretty amazing stats, and especially Gauntlet of Thebes is the reason why I don't think that Urchin is that good anymore. Gauntlet of Thebes gives you this effective health mix with a lot of health and protections. Not as many protections as you would have gotten from Height of the Urchin, but it works out because you get a lot more health instead, and you help your team more, and you don't need to stack. Not to mention the item is also cheaper. The only reason really that would speak for Height of the Urchin is that it has a better tier 2, and in the long run you will have higher defenses. But the job of a support is to soak up damage, not stand in the damage for the whole time and just soak up everything, but rather to protect his team, and auras help a lot with that. An Urchin can simply not provide you with that in the same way that Thebes can. Generally speaking, if you're a new support player and you start with these three aura items after your boots in every single game, starting with the Sov, then Thebes, then Heartward, you cannot go that wrong. Maybe if they have a purely magical or physical combo, or like 4 physicals or something, but other than that, this will work out if you don't know what to build. These items are never that bad. There are other options, we get into that now. Like I said, supports have many situational items, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to briefly address them. Feel free to stop the video and look at the stats on the side if you want to know more. First one is Mark of the Vanguard, a very cheap item that can be built later. It got nerfed recently a little bit, but it's still pretty good. It can still help you out if you don't feel like you're being as effective as you could be in early stages or getting aggressed on too much, or the enemies have a lot of tick damage. The next item is Winged Blade. They have a lot of slows. They have a Nemesis, a Bakasura, an Ares, anything like that. Get Winged Blade. This is the anti-slow item. It has very decent stats for supports. Outside of that, it's very cheap. So if you're against a slow heavy comp, get this item. Spirit Robe is the main remnant of the Selfish support build. Great item. Gives you a lot of defense for a relatively cheap price. Gives you cooldown reduction and gives you that initial mitigation in fights that allows you to really frontline. Very good as such. In this regard, I also have to give an honorable mention to Mantle of Discord. Great item now that the price has dropped a little bit. It is not quite as functional as Spirit Robe, which is a little cheaper and it helps initiating better, but it can help you if you're getting focused out a lot. Pestilence has an excellent mix of stats, even as a primary magical defense item, with its AG magical protection and 200 health, and it's a perfect anti-heal item. If the enemy team comp has a lot of healing, a lot of like meditation, self-heal, team heal, anything of that sort, get Pestilence. It's cheap, it's very accessible, it's good. Shogun's Kasari, more of a niche item in its sense, because it has magical protection combined with CDR and crowd control reduction and an attack speed aura for your team, which is super weird, but it's a lot of stats loaded into an item that's not too expensive, and if the team comp allows for it and you have a decent amount of health already, I would say this is a very good item. Rod of Asclepius is that bit of a situational item because it only really works on healing supports and it shouldn't be rushed, but especially Terra can make decent use of it if you build it later into the game. Spectral Armor is similarly situational, it just depends on the enemy comp. If they have guards that have to melee you in order to get their effects off, this item is really good. Think of Bakasura, think of Kali, think of Loki, anything like that. Mage's Blessing, a little bit underrated, it's probably not the favorite robe of most people, but still a very good item that can counter out specific guards very well. For example, our Kwang who cannot get his ultimate off as long as no one else gets the bubble off you. Stone of Gaia essentially has the same purpose, it's just specifically countering anyone who has a knock-up and has a little bit better stats in my opinion with a lot of HP 5 and a lot of sustain that it brings you while having a little less protections. I would say this is a great and underrated item, but it depends on the enemy team comp. Stone of Binding is a bit more towards the side. It's okay, it depends. It's often built on a more aggressive jungle guardians because the stats are not, it's not loaded with protections by any means, but it can help in certain situations to set up your team better and give that extra aggression to your team. And a quick honorable mention for Breastplate of Valor here. Like I said, as a CDR item, it can be really good, just don't rush it. There are more items for supports that are good. These are the more core ones that you will see in many games quite often and that will often make a good mix of items. Usually like 2 to 3 aura items and then maybe situational counter items for the rest of it, or maybe Spirit Rope if you don't know what to build. Something along those lines is what you're gonna see most of the time. As for relics, I don't think you can go all too wrong by building Meditation Cloak and Magic Shell most of the time. They're not always ideal, but if you don't know what to build yet and you're a beginner, these are totally okay. If you know that your guard needs Blink Rune, if you need to get into the fight and you don't really have initiation, like for example Sylvanas or Geb does, then that is obviously one of your pickups. There are more relics that should be used situationally, especially against slows, against healing, so anti-heal, and to slow the enemy and to get through walls, to get through obstacles and to counter knockup. Those are all in the relic tree. Just look at it yourself, you'll learn those relics, you will need them on every guard, so it doesn't make much sense to talk in depth about them here, because you will need them depending on the comp and you will understand it that way much better than if I spoke through all these items individually. Last but not least, let's quickly talk about the Selfish support. For those of you unfamiliar with it, this is a build that Incon and I developed in Season 3. This build doesn't really make sense in the current meta. Season 3 was a different kind of beast. Back then, Percentage Pen was a lot more available, so support simply needed higher defense, whereas now the focus is a lot more on Flat Pen and focusing out squishies with that, so you need to give them those auras a lot more. Well, the auras were never bad. You also need a lot more anti-heal these days. Back then, less anti-heal was generally needed, so that will now use up a slot on you often. You will often need Pestilence, but it will also use up a slot on the enemy. So for example, an assassin would get Brawler's Beatstick quite often, and that means that you will not need that much protection against his Brawlers because it's not Percentage Pen, it's Flat Pen. And also supports tend to show a lot more presence around middle lane than they used to when we came up with this build. So due to this presence, auras have been a lot more important than saving your individual butt as much as possible, because you will be tanky if you build these aura items now with Thebes and stuff. That's not a problem anymore. And you will still have room for other stats. You will still get your CDR afterwards. There are new CDR options as well, so you're not as forced into the ones that were there back then. And you will survive if you play smart. So really, you have everything you need. Even Watcher's Gift has more protections now. Before I end this video, I want to give you some additional resources that you can inform yourself with if you want to dig further into this. On one hand, Polar Bear Mike has made a very extensive guide for supporting in Season 4 items and build guide. I will link that right here. He goes a lot more in depth about many of the things. The video is a lot longer, obviously, so he explains in more detail and gives a lot of additional insight into the whole thing. So I can highly recommend checking that out if you just want to learn more. On the other hand, Emilzy is currently doing a series called In Hindsight, where he talks a lot about how his decisions in a particular game were from a support's perspective, so that can really help improving in the game as well. Both their channels are also linked down in the description. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was insightful. I hope this gave you a good idea of how to play support. If you are not subscribed yet, I would very much appreciate if you click the sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.